Between 1939 and 1945, roughly 70 million human beings were pulled into the largest armed conflict our species has ever produced. Soldiers fought across frozen tundra, equatorial jungle, open desert, and alpine mountain ranges, often with equipment that arrived late, broke early, or never showed up at all. And in that vast gap between what armies issued and what survival actually demanded, ordinary men invented solutions so effective, so elegantly simple, if that many of them still outperform modern gear today. These are not stories of generals or grand strategy. These are the small, brilliant tricks that kept soldiers alive when everything around them was designed to kill. And the remarkable thing is that almost every one of them works just as well on a weekend camping trip as it did on a battlefield 80 years ago. To understand why these techniques emerged, we need to understand the conditions that forced them into existence. The Second World War was, above all else, a war of logistics. Armies moved across continents at speeds that supply chains could not match. A division might advance 40 miles in a day and find itself without food, fuel, or functioning equipment for a week. In North Africa, temperatures swung from over 50 degrees Celsius during the day to near freezing at night, and the fine desert sand worked its way into every mechanism, every weapon, every boot. In the Pacific, the soldiers waded through waist-deep swamps where leather rotted in days and clean water was rarer than ammunition. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht discovered that standard-issue motor oil froze solid at -30, that rifle bolts seized shut, that exposed skin stuck permanently to bare metal. The official manuals had answers for some of these problems. For most, they did not. Oh, what filled the gap was an extraordinary culture of improvisation, one of the least documented and most consequential features of the entire war. Soldiers shared tricks the way earlier generations had shared folk remedies, by word of mouth, by demonstration, by watching the man next to you stay alive one more day. Field modification spread laterally through units, sometimes faster than official orders. A technique invented in a foxhole outside Stalingrad could reach a training camp in England within months, passed along by returning veterans and embedded in informal instruction that never appeared in any manual. The military hierarchy tolerated this because it worked. In some cases, it worked so well that formal doctrine eventually adopted what frontline soldiers had already been doing for years. This culture was not accidental. It was a direct consequence of the war's unprecedented scale and diversity. No army in history had ever operated simultaneously across Arctic, temperate, desert, and tropical environments. No supply system had ever been asked to deliver standardized equipment to men fighting in conditions that varied as wildly as the Russian steppe and the Burmese jungle. The result was a massive distributed experiment in practical problem solving. Millions of men, under extreme pressure, or independently arriving at solutions, and then filtering those solutions through the brutal test of daily survival. What did not work was discarded immediately. What worked was repeated, refined, and passed on. By 1945, the accumulated informal knowledge of frontline troops represented one of the richest bodies of survival technique ever assembled. Most of it was never written down, but some of it survived, carried home in the habits and memories of returning soldiers, taught to Boy Scout troops and hunting companions, embedded in the outdoor culture of the post-war decades. What follows are 7 of the most effective techniques born from that crucible, each one still remarkably useful today. The first belongs to the American infantry operating in the hedgerow country of Normandy, and, later, the dense forests of the Ardennes. Concealment was not optional. A visible fire at night was an invitation for mortar rounds. And the solution was a technique that soldiers called the Dakota fire hole, though its origins likely predate the war by centuries among indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. The principle was simple, but the engineering was precise. You dug 2 holes roughly 30 centimeters apart, one for the fire itself, about 30 centimeters deep and slightly wider at the bottom than the top, and a second, narrower tunnel angled to connect with the base of the fire pit. The second hole served as an air intake. As the fire heated the air above it and drew it upward, fresh oxygen was pulled in through the tunnel below, creating a natural bellows effect that burned fuel with extraordinary efficiency. The flames stayed below ground level. Smoke output dropped dramatically because the hotter burn consumed more particulate matter. Wind could not reach the flame, and when the fire was no longer needed, a layer of dirt erased almost every trace. Or soldiers in the 82nd Airborne reported using Dakota holes to heat rations less than 200 meters from German positions without detection, a feat that would have been suicidal with a conventional fire. For modern hikers, the Dakota fire hole solves problems that expensive equipment tries to address with mixed results. It burns roughly half the wood of an open campfire for the same heat output. It functions in high wind when a surface fire would scatter or extinguish. The recessed flame creates a natural platform for a pot or pan, eliminating the need for a grill grate, and it leaves virtually no visible trace, an advantage that matters as much in a national park today as it did in a combat zone in 1944. The second technique is closely related, but even simpler. American G is in both the European and Pacific theaters perfected what they called the buddy burner, a pocket-sized stove made from nothing more than an empty ration tin, a strip of corrugated cardboard, and whatever wax or fat was available. The construction took minutes. You cut a strip of cardboard to the height of the tin, rolled it tightly, and packed it inside so that the corrugation channels faced upward. Then you poured melted wax, bacon grease, or any available lipid over the cardboard until it was saturated. The result was a slow-burning stove that could heat a canteen cup of water in under 4 minutes, provide warmth inside a foxhole for hours, and fit inside a jacket pocket when not in use. Troops in the Ardennes during the brutal winter of 1944 to 1945, when temperatures dropped below -20 and supply lines to the front were severed for days, relied on these improvised burners to prevent frostbite on their hands and to warm rations that had frozen solid. One veteran from the 101st Airborne later recalled that during the siege of Bastogne, the tins were traded among soldiers almost like currency. A functioning buddy burner was worth more than cigarettes. For anyone carrying an emergency kit today, a buddy burner weighs almost nothing, costs almost nothing, lights reliably in wet conditions because the wax acts as both fuel and waterproof sealant, and provides a controlled flame that is far safer inside a tent vestibule or improvised shelter than an open fire. Or a single tin packed with paraffin wax provides roughly 90 minutes of continuous flame, enough to cook a meal, dry socks, and warm a small enclosed space. The third technique addresses a problem that has destroyed more soldiers than enemy fire ever did: wet feet. In every theater of the war, trench foot and its more severe cousin, frostbite, were responsible for tens of thousands of non-combat casualties. During the winter of 1944 to 1945 alone, the U.S. Army recorded over 45,000 cases of trench foot on the Western Front, more men lost to wet socks than to German artillery in several divisions. The British Army, drawing on hard lessons from the First World War, developed and enforced a sock rotation protocol that became one of the most effective preventive measures of the conflict. The system was straightforward, but required discipline. Every soldier carried at least 2 extra pairs of dry socks. 1 pair was worn. The second pair was kept inside the uniform against the body, where body heat kept them dry and warm. The third pair was drying, hung from a belt loop, draped across a pack, or stuffed inside a helmet liner. Every 4 to 6 hours, the cycle advanced. Wet socks came off. Warm, dry socks went on. The removed pair took the drying position. The previously drying pair moved to the body heat slot. Feet were inspected during every change for early signs of maceration, the softening and whitening of skin that precedes tissue breakdown. Commanders who enforced the rotation saw trench foot rates drop by as much as 75% within their units. Commanders who did not lose men by the hundreds to a condition that was entirely preventable. This system works precisely as well for modern hikers crossing streams, walking through wet grass, or enduring multi-day rain. Though the physics have not changed, prolonged moisture against skin breaks down tissue, and the most expensive waterproof boot on the market is useless the moment sweat or splash water gets inside it. The rotation system costs nothing, weighs almost nothing, and prevents a condition that can turn a pleasant weekend into a medical evacuation. The fourth technique was standard training for pilots and infantry scouts, but has largely vanished from civilian knowledge: navigation by wristwatch and sun. In an era before GPS, before reliable portable electronics of any kind, soldiers needed methods to determine direction with equipment they already carried. The analog wristwatch method was taught across Allied and Axis forces alike because it required nothing more than a functioning watch and a visible sun. In the Northern Hemisphere, you pointed the hour hand at the sun. The midpoint between the hour hand and the 12 o'clock position indicated south. In the Southern Hemisphere, you pointed the 12 at the sun and bisected the angle to the hour hand. The accuracy was not perfect. It degraded near the equator and required adjustment for daylight saving time, but it was reliable enough to maintain a general bearing across open terrain, and it could be performed in seconds without stopping movement. Downed pilots in North Africa used this method to walk toward friendly lines across featureless desert, where there was no landmark between the crash site and the horizon. And partisans in the forests of Belarus navigated at night using Polaris and switched to the watch method at dawn. Commandos behind enemy lines in Burma used it to maintain course through triple canopy jungle, where landmarks were invisible beyond 10 meters. In every case, the technique provided what mattered most in navigation. Not pinpoint accuracy, but consistent directionality. A man who knows roughly which way is south can correct course over distance. A man who does not can walk in circles for days. For anyone who has ever been disoriented on a trail without cell service, this technique remains one of the fastest ways to establish a rough cardinal direction. It requires no battery, no signal, no clear horizon line. It requires only a watch with hands and enough sky to locate the sun. Even through overcast, the brightest point in the cloud layer is sufficient. The fifth technique comes from the Pacific Theater, where tropical diseases killed more soldiers than combat in the first 2 years of the campaign. Vitamin C deficiency was a persistent problem among troops whose rations had been heat sterilized and stripped of most micronutrients during processing. Medics and experienced jungle fighters, some of whom had learned the technique from indigenous populations in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, discovered that steeping fresh pine needles in boiled water for 10 to 15 minutes produced a tea with a remarkably high vitamin C concentration. The needles of most coniferous species, pine, spruce, fir, and hemlock, were effective, though soldiers learned quickly to avoid yew, which contains toxic alkaloids. The tea tasted resinous and sharp, which most men found tolerable when the alternative was bleeding gums and loosening teeth. Units that adopted the practice showed measurably lower rates of scurvy-related symptoms, and the technique spread informally through forward medical stations long before it appeared in any official nutrition guidance. In the European theater, the practice was independently discovered by troops operating in the Hurtgen forest and the Vosges Mountains, where extended operations in dense woodland made resupply, erratic and fresh food unavailable for weeks at a time. For modern outdoor enthusiasts, pine needle tea is one of the simplest and most reliable sources of emergency nutrition in temperate and boreal forests. The raw material is available year-round, requires no special preparation beyond boiling water, and provides genuine nutritional value. Not a folk placebo, but a measurable dose of ascorbic acid. A handful of fresh needles steeped in a cup of hot water for 10 minutes contains enough vitamin C to prevent deficiency for a full day. The critical caution remains the same. One soldiers learned 8 decades ago: know your trees. Yew needles are toxic. Everything else with needles is generally safe. The sixth technique saved lives on every front, in every climate, and remains one of the most underrated pieces of survival knowledge in existence: waterproofing boots with animal fat. Any standard-issue military leather in the 1940s was reasonably water-resistant when new but deteriorated rapidly under field conditions. The treatment that soldiers applied universally was a heavy coating of rendered animal fat. Pig lard, beef tallow, or, when available, a prepared mixture called dubbin, which combined tallow with fish oil or beeswax. The fat was worked into the leather by hand, heated slightly to improve penetration, and reapplied every few days under wet conditions. The treatment did not merely coat the surface. The lipid molecules penetrated the collagen fiber structure of the leather, displacing water and creating a hydrophobic barrier that functioned from inside the material, not just on top of it. Soldiers in the Apennine campaign in Italy, where rain was almost continuous from October through March, He has found that properly dubbed boots lasted 3 times longer than untreated pairs and kept feet dry in conditions that would saturate a modern synthetic boot in hours. Mountain troops in the Alps carried small tins of tallow, the way later generations would carry blister tape. As a non-negotiable item of personal survival equipment, modern hikers who work with leather boots can replicate this with commercial products. But in an emergency, any rendered animal fat applied warm to clean. Dry leather achieves the same result. The technique extends the life of the boot, preserves flexibility in cold conditions where untreated leather cracks, and provides waterproofing that lasts through sustained exposure rather than failing after the first puddle. The seventh and final technique is perhaps the most dramatic in its potential payoff: the signal mirror. During the war, then standard-issue survival kits for air crews included a small polished metal mirror, usually glass-backed chrome or polished stainless steel, with a sighting hole in the center. The reason was physics. A mirror reflecting direct sunlight can produce a flash visible from over 50 kilometers away under clear conditions. Downed pilots in the Pacific used signal mirrors to attract the attention of search aircraft when no other signaling method was available. No flare, no radio, no smoke. The technique for aiming was precise. You held the mirror close to your face, looked through the sighting hole at your target, and tilted the mirror until the reflected light beam, visible as a bright spot on your own hand or on the ground nearby, aligned with the target. Practiced operators could hit a moving aircraft at several kilometers with a sustained flash. Post-war military tests confirmed that a standard signal mirror outperformed every other visual signaling device at distances beyond 1 mile, including commercial flares and smoke grenades. The flash of a mirror at midday was visible long after a flare had burned out and faded. One account from the Solomon Islands describes a downed Navy aviator who was rescued after 3 days on an uninhabited atoll, spotted by a patrol plane that caught the flash of his mirror from more than 40 kilometers away. Any hiker, kayaker, or backcountry traveler carrying a small mirror, or even a phone screen, a piece of foil, a polished belt buckle, carries a signaling device with a range that would astonish most people. In genuine emergencies, its search and rescue teams confirmed that mirror flashes remain one of the most reliable ways for a stranded person to attract attention from aircraft or distant ground teams. The weight penalty is 0. The cost is negligible. The potential payoff is survival. These 7 techniques share something fundamental. None of them required advanced technology. None of them required expensive materials. And every one of them was invented or perfected under conditions of extreme scarcity by people who had no option but to solve the problem in front of them with whatever they could carry, find, or build. The soldiers who developed these methods were not survival experts by training. They were farmers, factory workers, students, and clerks who were placed in environments that would kill them if they did not adapt. And they adapted with a creativity that formal instruction rarely matches. There is a broader lesson embedded in this history, and it goes beyond outdoor recreation. The most reliable survival tools are not the ones that depend on batteries, satellite signals, or proprietary technology. They are the ones that depend on understanding how fire behaves below ground, how moisture destroys skin, how light travels across distance, how fat interacts with leather at the molecular level, how a tree produces the vitamin our bodies cannot store. The soldiers of the Second World War learned these things because the penalty for ignorance was death. We have the luxury of learning them in advance, under far gentler circumstances, and carrying that knowledge the way they carried it, in our heads, where it weighs nothing